Hang on just a second.
Okay. Chaf Gimel on the base, around the middle of the page. We are in the sugya here, continuing to discuss what simonim are appropriate for returning an item based on the Mishnah in Chaf Aleph. So the question here arises, and we're exactly at Boy Minei Rav Bivi Mirav Nachman. It's roughly a little bit more than halfway down the daf. Boy Minei Rav Bivi Mirav Nachman. If everybody has it.
You said Ahmed Aleph or Ahmed Bays? I'm sorry.
Ahmed Bays. Chaf Gimel Ahmed Bays. It's
Okay.
about a little bit more than halfway down the daf, towards the second half of the line. Boy Minei Rav Bivi Mirav Nachman.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
So you recall that we had a machlokus between Rabba and Rava as to whether or not when you identify a siman, Rabba says that you identify, you mention the item, and a person then has to give you a siman on the item. And because of the kasha we had on Rava, Rava says no, that you identify the place, mokai. In other words, you say, I found an item at the corner of Arcola and Lamberton. Anybody who lost an item, identify the item. So according to Rava, that's an appropriate form of siman, is that you don't mention the article, you mention the place. So now comes Bibi Rav Nachman, and he wants to get into that inyan. And he asks, Mokum have a siman or lo have a siman? So what's the bottom line? Since there's a machlokes between Rabba and Rabba doesn't hold like Rava, so what's the truth? Is place a siman or not a siman? In other words, can you announce a place, and that should be enough for someone to either identify the item or not? Omalei, so Rav Nachman answered him, to need to. We learned in a brisa. Motzacha b'shel yayin b'shel shemen. We have this earlier in our daf. B'shel trua, a barrel of grain. B'shel grogris or figs. B'shel zaysin. Elu shalo. If he happens to find a barrel and there's nothing on the barrel to indicate who it belongs to, it's his. In fact, the Gemara b'sal kedachak l'machem avasimim lichvas makim. If you think that makim is a siman, why doesn't he announce, I found a barrel at the corner of, Lamberton and Arcola, and no, I'm sorry, I found an item at the corner of Lamberton and Arcola. Tell me if you think you lost something, identify. Then if someone says, oh yeah, I had a barrel of grain, I had a barrel of wine, then the brisa doesn't say that. So the chayre, it's a raya. Mokim is not a siman. That's his shaila here. It's very simple. If you found anything you find, announce the place. Omer Rav Zvid. No. You can't bring a raya from our case. Why? Hocha b'mayaskinan barakta denahara. That brisa is speaking about a particular event. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says barakta denahara. Bahayayin bor le'ir b'sfina. All these barrels, wine, oil, everything else, the method of shipment was through, they didn't have trucks, they didn't have all the land, everything was by boat. Ba'alokchen nipnim hasfina, u'minicha al sfasanor. So they had stevedores, right? Like we know them. What do? They go into the hold of the ship, they bring out the barrels, they put them on the sfasa hanahor, meaning like a dock, for instance. Benosan akas, and they take one by one. And sometimes a person forgets to take the barrel. So if you say, anybody lose anything at the wharf at First and Main, and the guy comes, sure, I had a barrel of wine there, a barrel of oil, or whatever it happens to be. Then so that's an unusual. So he says the emes is that according to this, he's saying that you can't bring a raya that Mokum isn't a simin, because if you put it on a wharf, you could have 10 people getting unloaded at the same time. And if you say that, then it's not a riot to one particular person. It's not unusual that a person might leave something. If he has a big shipment come in, he might forget one of the barrels. So if you announce it, that itself is not the simon, because it's such a popular place that it's not unique to one person who could say, I lost my barrel there. That's the teretz why this brisa is not a raya that mokim is not a simon, because we're talking about a situation which is, it's so, it is a circumstance where more than one person could have lost it, therefore you can't bring a raya. That's what the Gemara wants to conclude. Says Rav Zvid, no raya, barak de nahara.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Why would we exclude all Mokum? I mean, the wharf may be a rare case, whereas all of the Arcola Avenue, the individual ones, most of the situations, Mokum is going to be unique. Why would they? Why would they?
No, he said that's exactly what he's saying, because we wanted to bring a raya that Mokum is not a simon from this brisa, because if it was a simon, then he should announce it. Says the Gemara, no, in this particular case, it's not a simon because it's a wharf.
Yeah.
It's a place where people unload. But if it wasn't a particular type of thing like this, then maybe it is a simon, exactly to your point.
Okay.
Maybe Mokum really is a simon. The reasons why it's not a simon here is because we're talking about something that is so popular that everybody uses it, that you can't rely on the fact to say, oh, I lost it at the dock or at the wharf or at the port, whatever it happens to be. Why? Because 10 people could have had shipments on that particular boat, and any one of them could have lost it. So therefore, it's no raya from here. But to your question, it's not definitive that Mokum is or isn't a simon. Now, having said that, Omar Rav Mori, my tam Rabbanan rakta d'nahara lo have a simon. So Rav Mori goes into a little bit more detail. What's the reason that we say that the dock is not a simon? And as just as you could have lost it, so could your chaver have also forgotten, and therefore, okay. So bottom line, not a raya one way or the other, and he's just explaining that the reason why is because someone else could have lost it too. So now there's a very interesting Ika de Amre here. Let's take a look at the Ika de Amre. The Ika de Amre says, Omar Rav Mari, my tam Omar Rabbanan Mokum have a simon. What's the reason why the Rabbanan say that it's not a simon? In other words, Mokum. The Omrina Leki Heched Isram Lidach Hai Mokoim Isrami Naklechabacha Hai Mokoim. Look at the language. It's a little bit different than what we just said. He's saying, just like you could have identified a particular place and put it down, so too someone else could have identified a particular place and put it down. So what's the difference? What's the difference between what we just said and the Ika de Amre? It looks like it's the same thing, right? Look at Rashi. Ika de Amre, nafkemina, da'afila kivin v'oma mokum, Moshe Besuyim loy have a simon. According to this view, the Ika de Amre view, we're not talking about a wharf. We're not talking about an identifiable drop point, let's say, for goods. And there we said that's not a raya, because there anybody could have done it. Here we're talking about the boat stopped not at the dock, but made a stop somewhere along the embankment. Random, you pick it. stopped there and unloaded some crates or some barrels. So what is he saying? That even here, where it's unusual because he picked a random point on the route, he didn't go to the destination, right? Picked a random point on the route. And then I said, I'd like to, it's like the guy on the bus who doesn't want to go to the bus stop. Can you drop me off at my house? It's between bus stops, but the bus stop driver is nice, he'll drop him off. That's what it used to be. So here, he's saying, sure, I'll drop you off right in front of your house. And he drops them off and they take the barrels out. So the Iked Amri says, he goes weiter, he says, why is Mokum not a simon? Just like this place can be a particular place for you, so too can it be for somebody else. Therefore, what's the chiddush? According to this view, if he dropped them off at the port, it would be okay. It would be okay. In other words, verkehrt. According to this view, the first view, which says, no, I made a mistake. According to this view, the first version, which says that it's not a raya because he dropped it off at the port, would say here, in this particular case of the Iked Amri, that it is a siman. Now, the reason why the first version says it's not a siman, because it's a port, and anybody could have lost at a port. So therefore, you can't identify one from the other. Comes the Iked Amri and says, no, we're not talking about a port, we're talking about a stop along the way. And there, the person said, could you let me off? He lets him off. The chayra, that should be a siman. Says this version, no, because just like you picked the spot, somebody else could pick this spot. But according to this version, the first version would say it's okay. It is a raya. It is a siman if you picked a spot, because the first version only talked about a dock, which is universal to everybody. But according to the first version, if it's a miyuchet spot, if it's a spot that is particular to you, that would be okay. The Iked Amri says it's not okay, because just like you picked a spot, someone else could pick that spot. But according to the first version, because what's the Iked Amri coming to the Mechadish? We had a good answer. It was on a dock. Okay, enough. Comes the Iked Amri, says, no, it's not a dock. It's a particular spot along the way. What's he being Mechadish? So he's being mechadish that even a particular spot along the way, which you would think would be miyuchet to you, would be identifiable just to you, can be identifiable to somebody else. But according to the first version, that is a valid form of siman. And according to the first version, if he said, oh, I found it, I don't know, by the rock somewhere, and he gave some identifying place, that would be a good siman. That's the machlokes between the first version and the Iked Amri as to whether or not a miyuchet spot, not a normal spot, is considered a siman. According to the first version, it is. According to the Iked Amri, it's not. That's a chap here, because otherwise, what is he telling us? Okay, so that's the discussion here on simanim as to whether or not a place is a valid siman or not. Okay, so now the Gemara wants to go a little weiter and give us some further examples. Hu gavra de ashkech kufra bei matzrosas. If a person found kufra, what's kufra? Says Rashi, zefes, tar, dovish aimbo siman. Tar, you found a bucket of tar that people use, and it has no simonim. And where did he find it? Beimatzrasa, in a place that a wine press where they produce wine. Also, lekama de Rav. He came before Rav and he asked, "What do I do? Can I keep this? Can I keep this tar, this bucket of tar, which I found in the wine press? Omalei zil shokol nafshech. Go take it for yourself." And as Rav told him, there's no siman, go take it. So he asked the Shaila. Chazir the Havikor Machson. So then Rav saw that he hesitated. Machson Loshen Loisachmois, the Gamge Bedava Velibo Nokfo, he wasn't sure what to do, even though Rav told him, go ahead and take it for yourself. He saw that he hesitated. So Rav wanted to make the point, Amalei Zil Pulugle Lechia Bar Minhei. If you have any doubt, go split it with my son. In other words, he's telling him, if I'm not saying it for you, I'm telling you that there's no issue here whatsoever. If you have any doubt, split it with my son. I would never tell my son to do something improper. If you think I told you something improper, I wouldn't tell my son. So he says, go. He wanted to emphasize to him there was absolutely no question whatsoever, and it was okay. So what do we see from here? We see from here that Rav is saying that Mokim is not a siman. Because why doesn't someone just say that anybody lose anything in a wine press? I mean, it's right. It's an unusual thing. It's a wine press. It's a private place. It's not a place where hundreds of people travel, like a wharf or a dock or a port or even a spot along the river. So the Chayra, because he didn't tell him to make the announcement, Rav is being definitive and saying Mokim is not a siman. Of course, we have the Machlokes Rabbah and Rava, but he's taking the position that Mokim is not a siman. So the Mefarshim ask an interesting kasha here. The Rishonim say, ask, okay, what is this about? Someone found a bucket of tar in a wine press. A wine press is not a Rishus Harabim. Frag the kasha, why does the guy, the owner of the wine press, not get to keep it? Why is it something that if a person walks into the wine press and he sees this bucket there and he went to Rav says it's yours. Why is it yours? It should belong to the guy who owns the wine press. That's the shiloh that the Rishonim ask, right? Very simple. Okay, we're focused on the Mokim have a siman or not. According to Rav, Mokim is not a siman because he said you can keep it. What about the guy who owns the wine press? He should be the real owner here. So there's a discussion in the. If you remember, we learned several months ago how is a reshus kaina? So we said a reshus is kaina either, in other words, you have a piece of land, and let's say something falls on your land or an animal runs on your land, and you want to say, oh, it's mine. So what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says that if you have a fence around your land, then your land can be kind of for you because you have a reshus. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you have to be present. If you're not present when that animal lands on the land or whatever is on your land that you want to be kind of, you have to be there to say, oh, this is my land and I'm kind of. But if you're not there, you can't be off in another city and you get a Pony Express that says, boy, there's something, something very expensive is on your land. It says, oh, it's mine. No one can touch it. It's mine. There says you can't do it because if you didn't have a gather or something around your land, then your land can't be kind of unless you're there. So being far away doesn't help. So that's the teretz here. The teretz is that a wine press is not something that is specifically, yes, it's yours. You own the wine press, but people come and go. So unless there's some way that wine press is the equivalent of a gather, you wouldn't be able to be kind unless you're there, you the owner are there and say, you know what, that bucket of tar is mine. So that's the teretz. The teretz is that it's the wine press isn't automatically kind of because he wasn't there, and there's nothing in the reshus itself which is allowed to be kind of such as a fence around the field. But it's an interesting question because the very first reaction should be, what do you mean? You find it in a place, the place should be kind of. So that goes back to our machlokes, our discussion with the Gemara, and he says it's not kind of because it doesn't have the ability to be kind of itself unless the balabas is there and the owner of the wine press wasn't there, so he can't lay claim on it. Okay. So let's see, Rashi. Okay. Um, so says the Gemara, what we just said, Lema kosov Rav mokem loy have a siman. Let this be a raya. If Rav says that you can take it without a hesitation, that should be the raya that, like we just said, mokem loy have a siman, because otherwise it would be a siman. He should announce it that he found it in the wine press. Omar Rav Abba Mishum Yish Balim Nogaba the Chaza de Katra Be Chalfe. So the Gemara here says no, you can't bring a raya from this case. Again, we're trying to find to see if there's a definitive way of coming to a conclusion. Comes Rav Abba and he says no, there's still not a definitive way from this case, because here we're talking about Yish Balim, that there was Yish. It's no raya that the mokan is not kaina, because there was years. Why was it years? Because around the wild press where that bucket of tar was, he saw that weeds and all kinds of grass had grown up, meaning that it was there for a period of time. The katra bechalfe, says Rashi, Urte balaz godlo aleh shemamino miyomim rabim hoyesham bekvano asho habalim. This wasn't the case where someone put down a bucket of tar and left, and the kasha is, should someone announce it? This bucket was surrounded by growth that you, in other words, like bushes and weeds, you could almost not see it. That takes time. So there, he says, no raya that has to do with mokum, it has to do with yish. If someone leaves a bucket for presumably weeks, if not months, how long it takes for weeds to grow up over the bucket, the mistama he gave up. So in other words, if the weeds hadn't been there and you wanted to say this, maybe yes, then maybe you can come to a definitive conclusion, because it looks like it all happened in real time. But here, you can't say it happened in real time, because you find a bucket that's totally covered by weeds. You don't have to say it has anything to do with mokum. You have to say it has to do with yiyush. And a person who forgets his bucket of tar, which obviously must have had some value, because it's, what's a bucket of tar, but Nistama, he needed it, and it's an important thing, maybe it was expensive, and he forgot it, then that's the reason why Rob says, go take it, and if you have any doubt, split it with my son, because clearly he was miyayish after such a period of time. So we conclude this Gemara without a definitive answer, and we have the machlokes Rabba and Rava, where Rabba says that mokum is not a indicator, and Rava says it is an indicator, and we can't yet bring a raya. The Gemara tried from a couple of instances, and you can't bring a raya that it is or is not a siman. Okay. So now we're if you go back to Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, the Mishnah, we went through all the different permutations of the Mishnah of Bava Metzia, and now we're down to the last one. What was the last one? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Kol Kli Ampuria Ein Chayv Lahachris. And what's Ampuria? So Rashi says the Gemara Mefarish. Rashi in the Mishnah did not give us an answer. So now we're going to deal with what's called Kli Ampuria, where Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says Ein Chayv Lahachris. You do not have to return a Kli Ampuria. So let's find out what is a Kli Ampuria. So here we're going to learn some very interesting things, which many of us know, but now you're going to find the source of it, because there's some basic human element principles in this Gemara which are universal, but yet, here's the source. Shim Beleza Oma, my Empuria, Frank the Gemara. What is Empuria? What is Empuria? And Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel, Kalim Chodoshim Shalosh Shavasan Ha'ayin. Very interesting explanation. It's brand new. It's brand new kalim that your eye has not yet become accustomed to. So what is he coming to say? Rashi, Shalom Shivasan Adayin Lo Hurgu Buriyasan the Tashmishan Chi Makirin Yofet. It's not something that you've used where if you use it, you could say, oh, that's mine. I know it's mine. In other words, every brand new keli off the shelf looks the same. You haven't broken yours in. So you can't identify it by, again, we're not talking simonim here. This is not, it's just I, I identification. You look at an item and sometimes you can say, oh, that's mine. I know I have certain things where I might be hard pressed to tell you I have a simon, but when I look at it, I know it's mine for whatever reason. Okay, so that's what he says here. It's a new kli where the eye has not yet been accustomed because you haven't used it enough. So you're not accustomed. The Lashon and Puria, it's very interesting. Lashon and Puria, the Trikin Ein Po Re'iyah. Look at the word Anpuria. Rashi says Anpuria is Ein, Aleph Nun, Po, Pei Vav, Re'iyah, Resh Yud Aleph. There is not yet sight. In other words, identification by sight. That's a very interesting, it's an acronym for that term, that it's not a thing. Yeah, Menashe.
Yeah, so I mean, we have this sort of every year when it comes to Pesach, we pull out all the stuff, and some of the stuff, sort of family heirloom china, whatever, you know right away what this is. But then there'll be other stuff, drinking glasses or silverware, whatever, where you can't remember one year or the next. Wait a minute, was this milkshake? Was this fleshik? Was this? Was that? Because after a year, you sort of forget exactly what was what.
Right. But if you have an identifier, even it might not be a public identifier, but you could say, I know that spoon. That spoon is definitely mine for whatever reason. In other words, there's something about it because you've used it all the time. It's your favorite spoon that you could say, yeah, that's got to be my spoon. Now, the question is, if you took two identical spoons of the same type and put them next to each other, would someone be able to identify? That's a question. But because there's something about that is, without there being a siman, remember, if it's a siman, there's no question. The question is, without there being a siman, is re'iyah enough for someone to say that it's mine? So Anpuria means that he can't identify it by sight for whatever reason. It's too new, he hasn't used it enough. Frek the Gemara, Hechadon. Okay, good question. He is space siman. If there is a siman, what's the big deal if he can't recognize it by sight? But there's a siman. Either less space siman, in other words, he's being very practical. We're talking about simonim, that there's something about it that is a siman. It's a sign. It's an os. It's something that you can identify by saying. So what's this business about re'iyah? You're going to see it and you're going to say it's mine? Is there a siman? Is there not a siman? He asked a very practical question. What are you giving me a cup here? Is it a siman? Is it not a siman? Very good question. Okay. So Gemara says, well, oilom the less base siman. Really, there is no siman. So there's no way that someone can identify it through a particular sign. Nafkamina, and this is what I said before, this is one of those things that, we just accept. Nafkamina lahaduri tsurva mirabanan. The tsurva mirabanan were the clergy. So, we hold them to a higher standard. If someone is a Talmid Chacham, or he's a rabbi, or he's a member of the public sector where he has to deal with the public in a spiritual way, it's called Tzorva Mirabanan. The Tvias Eina, so the Gemara says, the Tvias Eina, with the look of his eye, Shivas Ha'ayin Kumle Begave Umahad Benule. So if one of these Tzorva Mirabanan came along and he saw this kli, right? It did not have a siman. The Gemara says here, the less space siman. But he looked at it and he says, yes, this is mine. We give him the benefit of the doubt because he's tzurva d'Rabbanan. So what is it telling us? That a person who is a Talmid Chacham, meaning he's very, very careful, very meticulous, he's very makbid, he would Khalila not take something, if he had a half a minute that wasn't his. So he has a high standard. If someone like that comes along and says, yes, that's mine, even though you couldn't pick it out from Adam, we say he's Surba Rabbanan, and that's a klal and shas. That's why I say this is where we learn this from, is that at Surba Rabbanan, we're given certain privileges because of who they are, and that they would never attempt to say this is mine without saying, yes, I know this is mine. I've worked with this for 10 years. There's no question it's mine. So you can't say it's a siman. There's no siman. Teretz is the look of an eye is enough to allow him So Tzur v'Rabbanan is a category that is kind of separate but above Simonim, and we will say that with Tzur v'Rabbanan we're going to allow him to take it. So, right, but if you can't recognize it, but if you can't, if in other words he's looking at it, says no, there's no way that I can tell whether or not this is mine, then he can't. So Kli and Puria is such a Kli where he didn't yet have the time to become accustomed to it. So this gives us a further understanding that Anpuria is something that you didn't have, even a Tzur v'Rabbanan might not have had enough time to look at it and say, yes, this is mine. Then, so Shimon Belazar says you don't have to return it because in that particular case, it's clear that no one can claim it. Now, having said this, Tzur v'Rabbanan, the Amar Rabbi Huda, Amar Shmuel, Rabbi Huda says in the name of Shmuel, V'hane talas mili avide Rabbanan mishane b'malayu. There are three things that, and again, dealing with Tzur v'Rabbanan, particularly, that there were three things that that they allowed someone to not be totally truthful, and he could shade his answer. He could shade his answer. In other words, we'll see why, but again, it's in that parsha of if someone is Tzur v'Rabbanan, then we give him license to be able to say something that would not otherwise be true. What are those three things? So it's interesting. B'mesechet, in learning, took a look at Rashi. Yesh biyotcha masechet ploni sedura begirsa olav. I don't know if you ever saw, but especially in yeshiva, but you come up to someone and you're learning the Gemara in the Dorim. I'm learning Baba Basra, you're learning the Dorim, and you come to me and you say, I have a sugya here in the Dorim, it's shver. Can you answer a question? The emes is, I could answer the question because I'm familiar with the Gemara in the Dorim. But because of anivus, you answer no. In other words, you're not telling the truth because you really could answer his question. But this shows a sign of anivus that I'm holding. You want to ask me a kasha? I'll look at it. I'll think about it. I'll come back to you. I'm not discharging you. I'm just not answering you right now. But I could answer you, but I'm not answering you. That's what Rashi says. Yesh biyotcha mesechet ploni sedura begirsa olav. Are you into this parsha? Even though he's into it, because he knows that machlok is in the Dorim, this is anivus. So anivus trumps answering a question on the spot. Not that you say, I won't look into it. Yes, I'll look into it, I'll come back. But that shows you a Talmud Chacham how he has to behave, that he shouldn't immediately say, sure, I'll tell you, because that shows, oh, I'm a big Talmud Chacham, you can come to me and I'm cold, and you ask me a kasha on the Dorim, and I'll give you a kasha on the Dorim, even though I'm learning another necessity. Very, very instructional. P.S. Having nothing to do with this, I just want to make an interesting point, and maybe this is true elsewhere as well, but there is, and Yale, maybe you know the answer to this. There is sort of a rule, I don't know what the source of the rule is, I know we were told this, that a lawyer who has a degree, he has a law degree, which is like a PhD. A JD degree is like a PhD. He does not call himself doctor. So there's some halacha here that he shouldn't call himself a doctor. He could even have a post-law degree, but he's not a doctor. However, if someone puts him on a panel and says, Dr. So-and-so, he doesn't have to say no. He doesn't have to deny himself the title, but he can't call himself a doctor. I don't know where that halacha comes from, but that's the way we were. That's the way we were taught. That it's a doctorate degree, but don't call yourself doctor. Now, so again, it has to do with a certain anivis. Well, I'm not as good as a PhD or as an MD. I'm just like everybody else. But Mishum anivis, yeah, Menashe.
And to emphasize the real world, I mean, I remember very well with Rabbi Einemer, that he very much was this way. I mean, you ask him a very, very simple question, he'd answer on the spot, but anything more complex, so I'll get back to you. And you knew that a lot of these things, he could have rattled it off right away. But there was this idea that the question is important. You don't pretend that you just know everything, and you do it properly.
Even though you do, but that's exactly the point. And listen, isn't that the story? We have all these nisim in the Torah, Elisha, all the nisim that we say we do it. We don't do it for farhesia. We do it with sinah, right? Well, he resuscitated the child, but he did it b'derech sinah, that it shouldn't look like there was that there should be a miracle in the Shemayim, because there's a certain behavior that a Talmud Chacham has that he should not sort of flaunt it. That's really what we're talking about. So it's very interesting, and this is the source of that. Now let's go to the next one. Upapuria, very interesting. In other words, it's sort of not proper anyway, but if someone wants to suggest or wants to ask about whether someone had relations with his wife, you shouldn't say that. I mean, first of all, it doesn't pass to even ask it. But if someone, so then in other words, you're allowed to say no. So far, Rashi says she yamshes mitoscha yomer lav midas tzniasi. In other words, I don't know where it would come up, but if it came up, then that a person should, because that's something just like with mikveh and all these other things, those are private matters that should not be publicized. So what he's saying is that if you're allowed to say not the truth in that kind of circumstance. Also mishum anivus. And the third one is the most relevant to all of us. And I remember this as a young boy, before I even knew the Gemara, I remember being told this. What is it? Uva shpiza. Shpiza means that if you're invited to someone's house and they give you a wonderful meal, and it's the most sumptuous meal you've had, you should not go around and popularize and say, I went to Menashe's house and did I have a meal? Because, and we see Rashi will say, it's not appropriate because that could put an undue burden on the host, because you mean it well. You want to say, my goodness, he, his wife, they're wonderful chefs. They treated me so graciously. Why shouldn't I say nice things? You could say nice things, but don't overstate it. Rashi ba'ashmiza, and listen for the reason. The reason is very interesting. She'alo al shmiza im kiblu b'sever ponim yafus v'oma lav midatovihi. It's okay. It was very nice. I had a nice time. Kadeshli kapsubo b'nei odom she'enim uganim, because you'll find unsavory characters who will say, "Oh wow, I can get a fantastic meal at Menashe's house. Love Atomadalov. I'll knock on his door every Friday night. I'd like to come for Friday night for dinner. I mean, you're a great host. Why shouldn't I come?" But listen, the Yachlis Mamono, Rashi says that you'll make him poor because he will be inundated with people who will want to come to his house for such a splendid meal, and it'll be a bad thing for him. So I remember I remember. The others I don't remember as well, but I remember that this was one thing that when we were learning stuck with me. The ba'ashpiza, you're not supposed to laud, in a huge way when someone does something, he treats you with a nice meal or everything else. Very nice. I had a nice meal. It was wonderful. Everything good, but don't go out of your way, even if it's true. We're talking about it's true. You're not exaggerating, but don't do it because of the ramifications that will come about. I'm sure Menashe would be very pleased to hear that he is such a great host, but he wouldn't be that pleased if he's got a line out of his door of people knocking in and he has to turn people away because he can't afford, to host all these people. So what's the shot here? Again, it's agav because we're talking about Surah the Rabbanon. We're talking about the Rabbanon and their fastidiousness and they're careful, they're makbid, and they won't do something that is improper. So the Gemara is telling us right away, but there's a caveat here that there are some things that they're allowed to do which isn't necessarily kahogan, isn't totally proper because of the reason, because usually the Indian of tznius or covet, or in this case, loss of monetary loss of money if he's going to be inundated with people. So
Well, suppose there's a conversation comes up, well, who makes the best marinara sauce? Who has a recipe for marinara sauce as well? Was over at Menashe's, and he had a great marinara sauce.
Yeah, but there Menashe can give you the recipe. Go make it. It's not going to cost them money. I have a great recipe. I'm happy to share the recipe with you, but not that people should line up to have it by him. So right. That's the killing. But you're right. You have to. There's a lesson here. Whatever you do it with a modicum of taste and what's appropriate. If you have a seichel, then you know what's appropriate. You know when to answer appropriately, when to say yes, when to say no. So Rabbi Einemer, as you said, I'm sure, he was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, and people who have a Bekias, I mean, you can literally put a pin in a Gemara and they can give you a whole pshat on the Gemara, but that's already showing, that's hubris. That's already showing a little bit, look what I can do. Now people have a photographic memory and I remember in yeshiva there was one such fellow. Literally, I mean, you can't over exaggerate his ability to his memory and his ability. So people would go to him because if they didn't remember, say, I'm trying to remember the sugya. We're in the middle of the sugya, and I'm trying to remember the sugya where it said such and such. So they went to him because he would remember where the sugya was, wherever it was in Shas. So he was kind of like the encyclopedia. But B'derech Klal, the person shouldn't show off his. Everybody knows he's a big Talmud Chacham. Okay, fine, good, but don't go overboard and show yourself to be so special. Okay, so again, we have a little bit of a practical primer here on how one should behave when a person comes to you. Okay.
Those aren't the only reasons you're allowed to lie, are they? I mean, you're restricted to those three?
Well, those three are.
Shalom bias. You're allowed, yeah. I mean, if your wife comes up and says, "Do I look good in this dress?" You're not supposed to say no. I mean,
right. So shalom bias. You have to exactly right.
You have to temper your.
You have to temper your answer exactly right, and so shalom bias is kind of a overarching siman that again, the question is, where do you go? How far do you go?
By the way, my wife always looks good, whatever she.
Absolutely. But no, so the question here is, how far would you go for shalom bias? For instance, if you outright lie, okay? If you know that it's going to create a schism in the family, could you outright lie about something that if your wife knew or she asked you and you would say yes to where it should be no, that it could create a really big issue? So again, that leaves a little bit more of a question, is how do you shade, what do you say? I mean, did you go to the bar? I mean, you can get in big trouble if you went to the bar. So if you say no, well, it's not true, you went. Okay, so there again, you have to use a little safe. And you have to use a little safe as to what in shalom bias is enough that you should not, you can't trample on everything. You can't, but you have to be smart. And you have to sort of use a little seichel here. Okay, so now this is that famous Gemara. So here's the source of the Gemara right here in Bava Metzia as to Tzurva the Rabbanon and what. And again, we're talking about Tzurva the Rabbanon, but as a practical matter, these are things that everybody should really even if he isn't exactly true with the Rabbanan, you have to have a midah of anivus, a midah of tznius, that this is how we are taught, and this is what we should do. Okay, back to the Gemara. Omer Mazutra. So Mazutra says, Lahadura le'avidita b'tfias eino. In other words, do we? So what's the pshat here? That a tzurva d'Rabbanan is allowed to identify something that maybe someone else would not be able to identify. So as Mazuta says, so he says that b'derech klal, he should be honest and he should be straightforward, except in these three things that we said, that he can shade it. So the question then is, in other words, so where does a lost object fit in? If he lost something, and okay, so in other words, the identifier of someone who we would give him the benefit of the doubt on a lost object is if he tells the truth about everything except the three things we just said. In other words, a person who's a yoshin, but when it comes to things of learning or of a shpiza, or in the case of with the Gemara says Puria, there he shades the truth. So such a person who his hanhaga, his conduct and everything else is very straight, except for these three, we give the benefit. That's what Marzutra is coming to say. If we know that he is straight on everything except for these three things, then if he says, I lost the object and I recognize it even without a simon, we give it to him. But if he has a practice of already shading the truth in a number of things, then he loses his status of being mitzvah rabbanan. So that's how the Gemara wants to explain it. What's the example? Again, famous. This is a famous Gemara. Mazutra Chasida, who was called a chassid, a pious person. Mazutra Chasida, angivle kasa the kasbe miyashpiza. Okay, so he was there, or he heard that a silver cup was missing from the host who he hosted a number of people, a number of students or a number of people, and so this came to Marzutra's attention, and it disturbed him that someone would go and take advantage of the hospitality of this wealthy person and steal a silver cup. Okay, Maisa of Yosef, all right. Bar Beirav, the Mashri Yodeh, again, famous Gemara. He saw that a young man was washing his hands, and he didn't have where to dry them. The Nagiv Beglima the Chavre, and he turned to his friend who was standing next to him, and he wiped his hands on his clothes, on the friend's clothes. In other words, he didn't have a towel, and he washed his hands, and he wiped them on his friend's things. And so what did he show? He showed no regard for someone else's moments. But he was a Talmud Chacham. He was a yeshiva boy. He was a student. This is the Ganev. Marzutra saw that and says, this is the Ganev. Why? Because he had no regard. So in other words, he was a tzurva d'Rabbanan. He was a yeshiva boy. He was Talmud Chacham. We gave him the benefit of the doubt. But once he saw that he deviated from the norm of what a yeshiva person should be by wiping his hands on the clothes of a of a fellow man and of a friend, and not being careful, then he said, no longer do we give him the benefit of the doubt that he's a tzur v'rabbanan. And then he says, kafte v'ode. Kafte v'ode. So then he beat him, or he beat him, says the Gemara. V'ode, and he admitted. So in other words, he pressed him, and he says, yes, I did it. So what do we see from this? So this is what Marzutra said, that if a person lives his life in such a way that he's very straight on certain things, the things that the Gemara says he can bend, he bends, then he's truly Mitzvah Rabbanan. Such a person, if he says, yes, this is my object without a siman, because again, we have to hold him to a high standard. But once you deviate from the standard and you no longer are a yosher in everything, meaning, look, but I mean, you went ahead and you wiped your hands on his clothes because you didn't have a towel. I mean, that's just not right. Says once he saw that, then he loses his standard of Tzurba the Rabbanan, and he's no longer considered a choshev. So let's look at Rashi. Angevle kisse de kaspa kli shel shpiza hoya. It was a kli. It was a cup of belonging to the host, and he went ahead and he did something improper. So Madrutra says that it's improper, and therefore he loses that status. So I think we'll stop here because the next Gemara picks up. It goes into a whole sugya having to do with the next iteration of this. But anyway, so from the Gemara we see that there's no raya on Mokoim, right? We concluded that there is no proof of whether Mokoim is a indicator that you can announce, and therefore we have the machlokes Rabba and Ravo, and remains the machlokes. And also we see that there are exceptions, and this whole Gemara that we just learned is the exception to that rule, that you normally have to have a siman, but in the instance where you have someone who's a tzurva rabbanan, and who is a tzurva rabbanan, the Gemara explained to us someone who's really a yosher in every way except for these three things. And of course, Shalom Bayis, Scott, that would be a sui generis inclusion. But if a person is makvid in what he does and he's careful, then he's considered Tzurva Rabbanan, and we give him the ability to say, even without a siman, that this is mine, and his eye, we rely on it that it should be okay. All right, so Mitzvah Shem, we'll stop here. And we'll pick up from Chavdal Amud Aleph next week. So now that Yom Tovim are coming, all of our Sundays are fine because it doesn't interfere with Yom Tov. So we'll continue Mitzvah Shem next Sunday, and even through the Yom Tovim we'll have a shiur every Sunday.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Very good.
Have a good day.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.
I'm told.